the time you hear the siren, it's already too late. One goes to the morgue and the other to jail. One guy's wasted and the other's a waste. It goes down the same as the dozen before. No one's getting smarter, no one's learning the score. Your never-ending spree of death and violence and hate is gonna tie your own rope, tie your own rope, tie your own... Hey! Isn't this just the perfect tie-dye t-shirt for me? Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And I bummed a cigarette off of Michael Shannon. That's not the whole story. This past Thursday, I took my butt up into the city right after work for the first screening of Eric Larue. This is a new independent dramatic film adapted by writer Brett Neveau from his 2002 play of the same name and directed by the aforementioned actor Michael Shannon, here making his feature film debut as a director. The screening took place at the very reliable Angelica Film Center and featured a post-screen Q&A with Shannon, LeBeau, and several members of the cast. I didn't really have anything to ask him, but, you know, after the Q&A was dismissed, I did take the opportunity to walk up to Shannon, and I was like, "Hey, Mike," like I know him or something. "Hey, Mike, you still smoke?" And he was like, "What?" And I was like, "You still smoke, right?" And he was like, "Yeah, I still smoke." And I said, "Can I bum a cigarette off of Michael Shannon?" Turns out he smokes American spirits just like me.
This is the cigarette I bummed off of Michael Shannon. Christ. I am a rock and roll motherfucker.
Before I left, I was sure to tell him the movie was really good, because it is really good. Eric Larue had a really interesting publicity campaign, though obviously quite a small one. I wouldn't be surprised if most people just kind of stumbling on this video won't even be aware of the film, but it was very strange seeing this film set up with this all-star cast, including the likes of Judy Greer, Alexander Skarsgård, Paul Sparks, Allison Pill, and the indomitable Tracy Letts, taking place against the backdrop of a small East Coast Southern community, seeming to deal in a rather conventional, quirky, indie dramatic comedy way with themes of marital dysfunction between Greer and Skarsgård's wife and husband characters, matters of religious faith as both Sparks and Letts play Protestant pastors, respectively, vying to both console and influence Greer and Skarsgård, only for it to be revealed at the very end of the trailer by Greer's character that her teenage son has murdered 3 boys from his school. Needless to say, I was instantly hooked, and while calibrating my expectations fairly, knowing that Shannon, while having experience as a theatrical director, including directing some of writer Brett Neveau's subsequent plays, I calibrated my expectations considering this big leap he's making to directing his own film production, and I must say the results are pretty stellar. The gist of Eric Larue is that it stars Judy Greer and Alexander Skarsgård as Janice and Ronald Larue, 2 parents contending with the emotional aftermath of their son, the eponymous Eric, walking into high school one day with a pistol and a shotgun and proceeding to murder 3 of his male classmates. Our story begins some months after this event. Janice is still stuck in a state of emotional paralysis, though the pastor of her church, Steve, played by Paul Sparks, strives to encourage her to not only reintegrate herself into the community, but to also agree to a meeting with the mothers of the children Eric murdered in order to find some path forward past the trauma for all of them. Ron, meanwhile, is at least outwardly moving on much more proactively from this family disaster, choosing to extricate himself from Steve's church to join a rival congregation led by Bill Verne, played by Tracy Letts, who is also trying to encourage Ron to encourage Janice to join him in his own rival meeting with the three mothers, one of whom is also a congregant of his church. There, Ron re-embraces his faith, attends weekly prayer meetings, and holds fast to Bill's motivation of him to pass on his burdens to Jesus and find a state of grace in his personal relationship with the Lord, while at the same time becoming increasingly cozy with Lisa, another congregant of Bill's church, who also happens to be Ron's HR manager at his office job. And unlike with the publicity, Shannon and LeBeau's film sets the stakes for this drama quite early, and while it never quite loses track of that underlying sense of both private and social trauma and crisis, the thing about Eric Larue is that it also unfolds in some really surprising ways that sometimes even seem to lose track of that underlying trauma in the same way that some of the characters, or at least Ron and the competing Steve and Bill, seem to so gracefully enfold that present crisis into their own interests, Ron seeking the solace and intimacy he can't get from Janice and Lisa, and Steve and Bill almost playing out through Janice and Ron this veritable religious schism in this small town. Torn between what one must surmise are in some sense earnest calls to guide, console, and motivate the faithful, but also competing for their attention, their respective methodologies clashing with one another through this rapidly disintegrating marriage. Shannon at the Q&A described his intention for the movie as being something a little more poetic in nature. And I don't know if necessarily a poetic function of it reads to the audience at like a basic emotional register, but I do think it's fair to say there is this sort of light allegorical function to it, especially in that idea of playing out the theme of a religious schism through the allegory of it being in one single town and affecting predominantly or focusing predominantly on one single couple that is being divided by these myopic differences in belief, where the tragic event is more like a catalyst for this schism, this breaking apart, how the two methodologies compete for their attention for them to tear them apart. But the thing is, in that sort of inverse way from the trailer, where in the trailer you have this sort of fake out setup that this is going to be much more conventional in a kind of quirky indie comedy drama way, what you get with Eric Larue is this movie that establishes very early on what the dramatic stakes are, what the emotional stakes are, this bleak cloud hanging over everything. And yet, it's still, for the most part, an incredibly funny movie. There are so many different filmmakers who would direct a subject like this with an oppressive, dour note that at every point, and quite frankly, one can hardly watch Greer giving this great complex performance that anchors the drama, this woman who is trapped in this kind of prison where she's reckoning with this horrible thing that her son has done, and to not think of a film like, say, Lynn Ramsey's rather similar psychological thriller We Need to Talk About Kevin. And just like with that film, while we're watching the ripples of this unseen violent event undulate throughout the story, it proves the source of so many bleak mysteries about the similarly unseen private lives and psychology of people in these positions. It really must be something quite traumatic, not only to be the person whose friends or family are the victims of a mass shooting, but especially for a parent who suddenly finds themselves cast in a potentially national infamy because their own child was the one who committed such heinous acts. And we know these sensational knee-jerk assumptions intuitively about them. How many of us have found ourselves thinking, man, these must have been some pretty terrible parents to not have noticed this powder keg that was about to go off right from underneath their feet. And the really harrowing thing for me about Eric Larue as a drama is that as we get to observe Janice and Ron both respectively trying to deal with this aftermath, to find their way through it, and even in the indirectly related contention between these two churches and pastors then gets almost parasitically glommed onto that trauma, LeBeau's script really does a fascinating job setting up for these actors, these characters that provoke us as audiences to think about intuitions like that, to ask ourselves questions about those assumptions, to come to doubt what we might have thought, only for us to then, as we observe Greer and Skarsgård expanding upon these performances, Wonder if there might even be some kernel of truth, if not the whole truth, to that basic prejudice. Is this story about the aftermath of this mass shooting, and specifically a school shooting, implying so much important emotional and psychological detail of everything we haven't seen preceding that violence and trauma? Is this a story where the dysfunction between Janice and Ron, the former's passivity, the latter's maladaptive religious mania in response to crisis, really at its heart a challenging and empathetic portrait of a pair of passive, mediocre American parents, just like so many American families have, that are simply reaping a kind of horrible reward for that passivity and mediocrity and lack of communication that, for however much so many outsiders can judge them by the roll of the dice, could have easily found themselves in the same thankless position of having to, as it were, bear the cross of what is actually a deep cultural and social problem that affects so many American families, so many of us in our conceptions about what the actual role of the family is in terms of rearing and steering our children, who may be themselves dealing with crises that we either are powerless to fully reckon with, or we simply don't want to reckon with them, instead just assuming that things will get better as time goes by. But then all of that stuff is further reinforced because it's enfolded into a context where the story and the characters are also themselves ridiculously funny to watch. Eric Larue is not by any stretch of the imagination a dark comedy. The dark parts of the story are presented as dramatically serious, even grave. The comedy, on the other hand, is even less akin to a typical indie comedy drama, and is really honestly more situational and predicated on what makes each character lacking in their own kind of self-awareness, or ridiculously over-earnest or desperate behavior in some way. Not just desperation in response to trauma, but the predicate of that desperation that was already there before the trauma started. Things we can identify in them that lie beneath the mask of the present trauma, the thing that has always been percolating in the background, just like these two parents not knowing that they have a future school mass shooter percolating in the private, always closed bedroom right on your right as you walk into your house. The comedy of this film is really rather shockingly humanizing and so crucial to what makes this film work, because even as it takes on this dark subject matter, it still grounds it in a dramatization of that subject in a way that we've never quite seen before, where regardless of how traumatic, even violent the situation is, people themselves are not exclusively dour notes that can be then simply pinned down in this long motif of fatalism and darkness and what tragedy does to people, yada, yada, yada. Even in these circumstances, people are still awkward and goofy and ridiculous and incompetent, and not just incompetent at things they have no reason to be competent at, but sometimes just blaringly, obviously incompetent at the thing they spend their life doing most of the time. And above all, in lacking a true self-awareness, not just the ability to be embarrassed or to feel shame at something, but literally you don't even know how ridiculous you look believing this is the thing that you're supposed to be doing, even though you might be terrible at it. And I think it really is quite brilliant how Shannon and LeBeau have been able to both reframe this sort of subject matter in that way, while never therefore giving into a more nihilistic, dark sense of humor. The fears that this film plays into feel all the more credible, because the characters also feel credibly, accessibly absurd and flawed, not just in character ways, as in capital C character to a real person, but flawed in just awkward ways, in abstract ways. They and their lives and their behavior are not simply confined by the superficial content of such a dark subject. They are still fully realized as people who are sometimes just a joy to watch because they are not perfect ciphers of deep psychological and emotional wounds, but, just kind of mediocre, largely complacent, ridiculous players in the broader play that is life, which is just as much a tragedy as it is a comedy. First as tragedy, then as farce, even the story of mass shooting in America. There's definitely ways that the script is still kind of dated, especially in its characterization of the possible motives of a mass shooter. LeBeau actually wrote the play that this film is based on in 2002. It was in direct response to Columbine, the Columbine High School massacre. And there are still psychological elements of this story that seem a little stuck in that period. And as a first-time director of a feature film, Shannon's control of his vision isn't quite lacking in a certain roughness around the edges. But Eric Larue is still a magnificently written and directed drama that really does something bold and new with one of the most serious subjects in American life, and with a virtually perfect ensemble cast that is able to keep this collision of harrowing drama and situational comedy in a poetic balance. I'm going to be giving Eric Larue a 4.5 out of 5, one of my favorite films of the year so far. Really hope this branches out soon and more people have the opportunity to see it. With that, I'm going to tap out. Thank you so much for sitting through this whole video. Don't be afraid to sound off in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please like, share, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.